Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. This week I'm back home in London, so I thought it would be a good chance to check in with Michael Fallon. He's a former UK Defence Secretary, and I first met him when I interviewed him about BAE's bid, which they won to build Australia's Type 26 frigates, a new design that the UK was designing. Lots of problems with those, but anyway, given everything that is going on with Iran, questions around the UK's role or not in aiding Trump's campaign in Iran, and also the broader effects that this has had on the alliance with the United States, very angry that Europe and Asian allies, including Australia, Japan and South Korea, have not rushed to his defence or to his aid to help fight this war against Iran, which he started at the end of February, very surprisingly, and catching allies unaware. I thought it would be good to check what the mood might be if the Conservatives were still in power. And this has been a big subject of political debate. It was very interesting to me to gauge Michael Fallon's views on this. He held his opinions very strongly, and I must say they would almost be unfashionable in most circles today because you don't hear a lot of voices saying it's an automatic yes that the allies should have gone to Trump's aid. But Michael Fallon is one of the few who does say that, and very loudly and publicly, and I'm very delighted to say that he joined my podcast late last week. I began by asking him if he thought NATO was dead.
Oh, NATO isn't dead. I mean, NATO needs strengthening and needs reviving, and to some extent both Putin and Trump are helping that process. I've never known NATO more active in looking over its plans, improving mobilisation. It's adopted a new spending target. So there is certainly plenty of life left in NATO. That said, it's obviously a very big alliance. There are differences amongst NATO members that perhaps there weren't 10 or 20 years ago. And there is, of course, the difficulty of the overall relationship with the United States. So there's work to be done. But NATO is by no means dead.
The reason I ask that is not because of spending targets or anything like that. I ask it because in the last few weeks, no one has done more to undermine Article 5 than Donald Trump, suggesting that he doesn't like NATO, it didn't come to his support, he thinks it's a paper tiger. If you're a baddie and you're wondering if the US has Europe's back, isn't this the time to go?
Well, first of all, we've heard this before from Donald Trump. I heard it in his first term when I was Defence Secretary. He was openly critical of NATO, not just of its spending, but even of the concept of the alliance and indeed Article 5. And he came round to NATO after a rather bad-tempered NATO summit where we did pledge to increase spending. He then came to Warsaw and made a fine speech upholding the nature of the alliance and the importance of Article 5 protection for everybody. And don't forget, Article 5 was only ever triggered in defence of the United States, not in defence of a European member of NATO. So I think beyond the rhetoric, you've got to look at the reality. And the second, I think, big point is that these conflicts, the one on our own continent and the one now in the Middle East, are increasingly one conflict. They're connected. We're facing common enemies, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and to some extent China, who wish us in the West harm. And that's why, in Ukraine, for example, helping Russia, you have Iranian drones, you have North Korean troops, you have Chinese weaponry. So we've got to work harder in the alliance in persuading the United States that this is all one conflict and that, we are ready to help. Now, there have been plenty of gaps, and there's plenty more that NATO could be doing to reassure America that this is a mutual alliance.
Like what?
Well, we could have stepped up earlier in the current conflict, for example, in making sure we supported in defending our own bases and interests in Europe, that we did support what the United States has been doing in response to Iranian missiles and so on. The Strait of Hormuz is not an American strait, as Pete Hegseth was quite right about that. It's our strait. It's where our oil and gas flows. And the BAB is the same. It's where international trade flows. And it's part of our responsibility to help defend those international waterways.
Mm-hmm. But I thought NATO was a defensive alliance. This was a war that the United States started. So aren't we confusing the purpose of NATO here?
Well, NATO has had an operation in Afghanistan. NATO has operated in Bosnia, had a mission to Iraq. NATO interests are obviously threatened when Iran can threaten its neighbours and when Iran can destabilise a region that is fundamental to the overall economic prosperity of the NATO region. But beyond that, NATO has very specific interests. We do. Other NATO countries also, like the French, have interests in the Gulf, and we're fully entitled to protect them and to help the United States protect them.
So one issue is that Trump didn't consult allies, I think, and that is a difference between what happened with Afghanistan and Bosnia and why we had coalitions go in. But individually, talking in terms of member states here, you seem to be very sympathetic with Trump's argument here. You feel we should have been contributing to this war from day one.
There are lots of ways in which you can criticise the way Trump has handled the conflict, the slight confusion about the overall mission, the failure to consult allies properly. Of course you can. But overall, there are British interests at stake in making sure this conflict is brought to a quick end and then dealing with some of the root causes to this. Iran's nuclear missile program, we should have dealt with years ago. Iran's destabilizing of its neighbors, we should all have done more to forestall collectively a long time ago.
Do you think Trump's got control of this war?
They're very hard, these conflicts, to control once they start. And that is certainly one of my concerns. They can spread very easily. There is enormous capacity for miscalculation. And countries that never thought they'd get caught up in it can then get caught up in it. So I don't think you can entirely control and direct a war. That's why you do need a very clearly established mission. You then need very clear rules of engagement. I was involved in leading the British effort in the 3.5-year war against Daesh in Iraq and Syria. And again, with the Americans and lots of other countries in that coalition.
Yeah, we
had
contributed to that in Australia.
The Australians did too. We had a clearly defined purpose. And that, I think, at the moment is confusing the Allies.
If we were in a hypothetical world, as you point out, and going to contribute to this war, with what?
Well, with the assets that we have now.
We couldn't even send Dragon for weeks.
I think our response has been very sluggish. I don't criticise John Healey himself, but certainly our defence response could have been sharper. We needed to get troops and planes and, yes, ships and missile defence to the region. But we all need to do that. It's not just us. It's not so long ago, I think 5 or 6 years ago, that Australia had a frigate in the Strait of Hormuz. It's not so long since we all rallied before, and we need to rally again. 2 years ago, our aircraft were bombing. We're dealing with Iranian missiles, if you remember, in the attack against Israel. So, we've been involved before. Now, we'd all have liked this conflict handled differently, but that doesn't mean that when the call comes, you've got to be ready to respond.
Okay, this is very interesting. Trump keeps complaining, Australia, UK, you weren't there, you should have sent your aircraft carriers. Can we be precise? Because what seems to have emerged from this is that the Navy is really caught with its pants down. It couldn't send HMS Dragon, your main fighting ship, I think for about 2 weeks. It had to do 6 weeks of maintenance work in 6 days to get her ready and sailing. What exact assets do you have to send?
Well, I'm not speaking here for the Ministry of Defence. I'm long retired from being responsible for all this. Clearly, it took too long to help out in the Gulf with the kind of defence I think that our allies and partners would expect, particularly the defence of our own base in Cyprus. We've sent planes. We could possibly have sent a ship earlier. That ship we did send had to be refitted because it was earmarked for a different mission. And there is missile defence and more aeroplanes on the way. But yes, that could have been earlier, and it could have been sharper.
And do you think Indo-Pacific countries should have been involved in this, as Trump is asking? Korea, Australia?
Well, the point I made to you earlier is that the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb, these are international waterways on which the world economy depends. If it was right for a country like Australia to come and help 5 or 6 years ago, why is it not right now? Now, it doesn't have to be a ship. Aircraft can be sent, patrol aircraft, refueling aircraft. There are other assets that can be deployed, other logistical help. When we were dealing with Iraq in with the Daesh in Iraq and Syria, countries that couldn't send strike aircraft did an awful lot to help with the logistics in providing all the backup that those countries who were striking with jets needed. So this should be more of a collective effort.
For the record, Australia has sent an AWACS, so a surveillance plane. I wonder, though, let's put all that aside about what could and should be done. I wonder, the reality is we haven't. The alliance has not rallied behind Trump on this. Trump is very angry, and it's led to divisions. Is Trump himself a problem in keeping the Western alliance together? Is that what we're seeing is the result of what's happening in Iran?
Well, first, I think Trump is frustrated because this conflict is not ending as quickly or as neatly as perhaps he originally envisaged. And it's becoming clearer and clearer that the Iranian regime is not going to topple, and that freeing up the Strait of Hormuz in particular is going to be a very, very difficult thing to achieve. And I think Trump is getting frustrated that if those were two aims, it's going to take some time before he can declare any kind of victory. In terms of taking it out on the alliance, the United States is perfectly entitled to ask its allies to do more, to offer more. And, we hesitated. We hesitated to allow use of the bases, even to defend our own bases and interests. Eventually, Starmer got there, and I give him credit for that. But that was sluggish. And we've seen other European members of NATO being equally unwilling to provide any kind of backup, even in terms of allowing overflights, which is not a huge cost on a country except politically. So I think Trump is feeling that the alliance is not pulling its weight.
But we have done those things before. So back to my original question, do you think it's a Trump factor that's now making it, you were political, you understand the need to balance the public sentiment here. Do you think Trump's making it impossible for allied leaders to back him?
Well, I think certainly it would have been easier if Trump had been clearer about the nature of the mission from the very start, because there are obviously aims that the whole alliance will sympathize with: the need for Iran to scrap its nuclear program and stop harassing its neighbors. These are things the alliance could support. But I think we would have expected more consultation and a better defined mission.
Do you think the alliance heals after Trump?
Well, it healed after Trump last time, if I can put it like that, after his
But this
first
is
term.
worse. What's happening now is worse than first term, isn't it?
Well, there's still work to be done, but the overall effect of Trump's first 4 years and his first and the second year, overall effect of the 5 years, of course, has been to quite dramatically increase NATO defence spending. We've seen all the laggards reaching 2%, but we now have a new target of 3.5%. And some very substantial commitments to defence by countries that weren't at the forefront before, notably Germany and Poland.
So I'm going to share a little anecdote with you. One of the reasons for the surprising endorsement that Trump gave the Australians during the bilat with Anthony Albanese last year in the White House about defence spending, which people like me in Australia certainly campaigned for the government to raise defence spending to a higher level. One of the reasons the Americans let the Australians off was because the Australians went to Trump and said, well, if you look at the UK and some of these other European nations and you look at what they really spend on defence, it's pittance compared to what we're doing. And if you look at what we really do, because we don't use the accounting tricks on intelligence and things, it's about 2.7%. And that's why we got the tick. So you were a defence minister. You were in charge of spending levels. Why did you fail to raise defence spending to a position where we might be in a safer place today to deal with what challenges are coming our way?
Well, first, I don't accept your distinction between NATO accounting and Australian accounting. What is classed as defence expenditure is agreed between the allies. These aren't tricks. Some stuff some countries put forward as defence spending is ruled out. So there's quite a strict, the criteria are relatively strict, and it's either ruled as defence spending across the alliance or it isn't. So I don't accept that particular distinction. So far as the target is concerned, we adopted the 2% target in 2014, and my job as Defence Secretary was to meet it. We were below 2% then. We met it the following year. It's taken most of the alliance, another 8 or 9 years to meet the target, and the same now applies to the 3.5% target. We should be meeting that as quickly as possible.
And why aren't we? What goes on in government that stops us realising the situation and appropriately funding defence?
Well, we have a Labour government which is not as committed to defence as we are. Instinctively wants to spend on other things, particularly on overseas aid,
Sure,
particularly
but
on
Ben,
welfare.
Ben Wallace is on the record saying this was a Tory problem too. This is decades of underfunding in defence. It's Tory and Labour.
You can argue that we spent more, of course, during the Cold War. We spent more, in the 1990s, but since that point it went down until the Wales summit, until we set the new target of 2%, and we then started raising it again. Now, you can go back and say we should have raised it faster in the Tory years. That's perfectly possible.
And should you have?
Arguably, yes, we should have. I was responsible for 3 of those early years, from 14 to 17. The world then became more dangerous. It obviously became more dangerous, after Crimea and some of the other conflicts that we had. So there was certainly a case for raising it faster in the latter years of the 2010s. But the issue is now, and you have a Labour government that clearly is not prepared to cut overseas aid further, and it certainly doesn't look like being prepared to cut back on welfare. And unless you do those 2 things, it seems unlikely they're going to very quickly find additional money for defence. Now, they've said they will, so let's see how quickly they can do it.
When you were Defence Secretary, did you make that case that we should even go beyond the 2%? Were you doing that inside government?
Well, we were increasing the budget all the time. It was, I think it was well over 2.1% when I left. Might have been closer to 2.2%, but we were increasing it each year from a very low base, from a position where there were necessary cuts during the financial crisis before I came into office, but the budget was rising. What you're arguing about is, should it have risen faster earlier? And yes, in hindsight, and it's always hindsight, it probably should have.
But I'm asking, did you do that at the time? Or were you content with getting to 2?
No, the arguments about defence spending were constant, because it was clear to us by 16 and 17 that some of the efficiency savings that on which the 2015 Defence Review was predicated were taking too long to realise. Closing airfields and selling them off for housing, closing redundant barracks and so on. So we did make the case to the Treasury for further increases.
So here's a little set of numbers for you. When you were Secretary of State, the Royal Navy had 76 commissioned ships. That was already down from 97 2000. Again, not your fault, that was Labor. But by the time you leave, there's 63 commissioned ships. And I'm told around 32,000 active people. When you're seeing those numbers, and yes, I certainly hear you saying you were overseeing a raise to 2%, were you looking at capability and saying, oh my God, we are diminishing in what we can do, and I think there's an alarm bell we need to start sounding here? Did that happen?
Absolutely. I was looking particularly at the capability of the Navy. It was clear the Type 23 frigates were coming to the end of their lives. So we started the Type 26 programme. I cut steel on the first, HMS Glasgow, in 2017. And there will now be 3 or 4 others as part of that programme. And I then commissioned the lighter frigate, the Type 31, which is now being built up on the east coast of Scotland. So it was very, very important to us to regenerate the destroyer and frigate fleet, if you like, the frigate fleet in particular. And that was, fairly urgent from 2016 onwards. We also had a submarine program, if you recall. We were putting a lot of money into completing the Astute program, and we were starting to build the new dreadnoughts. So I think I labelled 2016 as the year of the Navy. We started, one of the biggest rebuilding programs the Navy has ever seen. And of course, these things, it takes 8 or 9 years to build a new frigate. It takes, 10, 12 years to build and trial a new submarine. These things do take time. But we got that rebuilding program underway.
So let's talk about that time, because that's the year 2016 that I moved here, and I think we may have had an interview around that time, because you sold us those frigates in Australia. It was a very, very big deal. But they're behind schedule, of course, and we have now the same arguments being run about AUKUS and Britain's ability to ever create and co-design these AUKUS submarines with us. I don't think it looks like to anyone from the outside world that Britain can capably build what it promises fast enough. Do you think that's fair and accurate?
I think the concerns are fair, and I've made that point in Washington. I should be speaking at an AUKUS conference there later this month, where there are concerns about the productivity of the American yards in respect of the Virginias. There are equally quite legitimate concerns about the productivity and the pace of the program at Barrow. So we have a real challenge there to step up the productivity and make sure that we don't get the slippage with the new submarines that we saw with Astute. And that is definitely a challenge for the government to improve the productivity and to make sure there are no budgetary constraints on the way that program is completed.
And do you have roundabout sets of either figures or programs or things that are needed to ensure that doesn't happen, that slippage?
Well, I've been out of this for nearly 10 years.
But you're still
now.
working in the space, and you're working heavily on AUKUS, I think, aren't you?
I'm following AUKUS fairly closely, and I'm as determined as anybody that we should not be letting anybody down over AUKUS. It's a challenge. It's a challenge to keep that share of the defence budget on the submarine programme, and it's a challenge to improve the productivity. The scale of what Barrow has to achieve in the next 10 years, is enormous. They've got to complete the dreadnoughts, and they've got to get going on the new submarines. So there is an awful lot of work to be done.
You sound a little bit more sceptical about this issue. Are you worried?
No, I'm not worried, but I just think we should acknowledge the concern of allies, and particularly of Australia, because Australia probably, at this stage, it's very hard to see what other options Australia has if the programme does slip. And therefore, we should recognise those concerns as legitimate, and we should be making sure, all of us and all three of us, that we are going to resolve this particular challenge. And that's not just the productivity itself, it's making sure the nuclear enterprise is successful, that we are on both in Britain and Australia recruiting a whole new generation of people working on nuclear submarines who can make sure that these boats are fitted out and then maintained.
Do you think we've run out of time to get AUKUS going? Because if you're looking at the window where we know this, President Trump has said this on the record, this is about helping deter China from Taiwan and dominance in the Indo-Pacific. That window's already opened for us. She has set 2027 as the be ready date. We're not going to have these subs in the water earliest 2040s.
Well, I think possibly a bit before that, but we'll see. But I'm pleased that President Trump has recommitted to AUKUS, that their review came out positively. There were obviously doubts when he came back into office because he hadn't endorsed it at the time, because I suspect because it was a Biden agreement. But he has now. They've reviewed it, and perhaps some of the potential critics in the Department of Defense in Washington, have come round to it. But the urgency is there, the challenge is there, and the three countries have got to work together to deliver. And we've also got to refocus on Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which certainly did slip in the early year or two, and we've really got to hone down now the particular areas that we want Pillar 2 to focus on, and get those mandated and get some serious money behind them.
Let's move back to Europe. This morning, the First Sea Lord has come out and said that Britain is not ready to fight a war. That's a disastrous legacy for you, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it is a legacy, actually, and I think his words weren't misquoted, but George Robertson in his Defence Review last summer said we were underprepared and we were underinsured, and I think that's a better formulation. We have a lot to do to step up. Now, it's not just Britain, it's the alliance as a whole. We are part of that alliance, and there are other countries as well that also need to step up.
Richard Barrons, who also wrote the strategic review, came out this week and said that the British Army could take at most a small town. This is Dad's army kind of stuff. How did did you let this get so bad?
Well, I don't think we let it necessarily get so bad. It was 80,000 strong in my day. Army numbers have slipped considerably since then, and there have been, I think, recruiting issues. But in my view, we should recommit to an army of at least 80,000 so that we can convince our alliance partners that we are ready to field troops in number, whether it's defending Estonia and Poland or whether it's eventually to commit as part of a peacekeeping force in Ukraine. You do need numbers, and I think 80,000 is the minimum.
Do you think we need national service?
I'd like to see us adopt some form, as the Nordics have, of competitive national service, where it's a badge of honour to get selected for it. If you're leaving college, it makes you instantly more employable. In other words, you set a certain number of places and open up a competition for them. And within a couple of years, you found in the Nordics, and this is something employers absolutely valued, and people fought to get places on the scheme. You need something like that that reverses the old conscription model where the armed forces were given hundreds of thousands of young men who didn't want to be there, and which obviously cost them a lot in terms of time and money in training.
What is the biggest danger you see ahead, let's say the next 12 months? Do you think there's a potential for, you said we're fighting one war, do you think there's potential for us all now to be dragged into fighting this one war more broadly, whereas Ukraine was quarantined or contained before?
Well, the point I make is it wasn't really contained. As I said, it embraced Chinese technology, Iranian drones and North Korean troops. I think we have to wake up to the fact there are countries out there that really wish us harm, and they are working collectively together against us. They're opposed to our financial system, they're opposed to a lot of the Western international architecture, but they're also using every opportunity to challenge us, whether it's through hybrid attacks in the grey zone or whether it's pressing home the conflicts that there are at the moment. And you see Russia helping Iran, and you see China actively helping in Ukraine.
What capabilities do you think we need to develop the fastest, if you're looking ahead?
Well, we need to recommit, obviously, to missile defence. I think we've all learned from Ukraine that missile defence has got to be a big part of our defence. And that means not just looking at drones, but also looking at interception and sensors and the other bits that go along with missile defence. We've got to press ahead with the new jet aircraft, with Tempest. That's going to be very important. You see how important the RAF is at the moment in carrying out strikes. They must have their new aircraft. And we've got to crack on and keep rebuilding the Navy, which is getting those new frigates out there and accelerating the Type 26 programme, as well as developing the autonomous systems, whether they're hunting for mines or dealing with drones. So the threat is real now. This is all happening to us at the moment, and we've got to get on and invest in this stuff. Now, look, we had a very good defence review last year that set out very clearly the sort of things we need to be doing, but that had to be followed through, and we still don't have our defence investment plan, which lists the actual priorities that British and other defence companies can now tool up and meet.
When it came out that you being Britain, couldn't even defend the base in Cyprus, were you embarrassed?
I was certainly awkward that they were able to fire a missile straight into one of the hangars there. And there may be questions to be asked about whether or not we had sufficient warning of that and how the air defence was organised. But again, as I said, we should have moved faster. We should have moved stuff to the Gulf more quickly. And Starmer should have recognised, as he has now recognised, that there are British interests at stake, not just the base in Cyprus. There's a British base in Bahrain. There are British troops and assets across the region, and they need to be protected.
What's your biggest regret? And what's the biggest achievement you think you made as Defence Secretary? And what would your advice be to Mr. Healey?
Achievements, I think, really is for others to judge. I think having a very specific war, the war against Daesh in Iraq and Syria, conducted with a huge international effort, but in a very clinical way, we got Daesh out of Iraq, which is now a fairly fragile but a functioning democracy. And we started to get Daesh out of Syria, and there may be hopes now for a better regime in Syria. And Daesh was a menace to the whole world. And we didn't get or expect a lot of credit for that particular campaign, but it was an example perhaps for the future of where you can achieve something without putting boots on the ground, if obviously you have control of the air, but using air power and using training and helping to train an army on the ground. You don't have necessarily to commit your own troops to fight. And that was very different to the earlier campaign in Iraq and the campaign in Afghanistan. So it was a huge effort, particularly by the RAF, but also by army trainers. And I'll always be proud of what they did there in getting rid of Daesh from the Middle East. Biggest regrets, we didn't do enough to rescue British hostages in the early weeks of that conflict. If you remember, there was some appalling slaughter of British and other hostages by Daesh. There were various schemes to try and rescue them, but it was very difficult to find out exactly where they were, and I will always regret that and some of the other things that happened at the time. And yes, you can go back to defence spending. It now looks much more obvious that we should have increased defence spending faster than we did. I'm proud we got to the 2%, but clearly now we've got to do better. Those days we were second in NATO. Today we're 12th as a NATO spender. That's not good enough. We should be leading in NATO. I'm sorry, there was a third question at the end there.
What would your advice be to John Healey, from Defence Secretary to Defence Secretary?
Well, I have a lot of time for John Healey. He's clearly a very thoughtful and serious Defence Secretary. I would hope he would be as muscular as he can be without worrying so much about the politics of every decision as to what Number 10 would think about this, that and the other. I would hope he could be as muscular as he would want to be in terms of standing up for defence, in terms of the overall budget, getting Number 10 to agree some fixed dates for the higher target, getting that defence investment plan out, and so that British industry can start to regenerate, and then continuing to help America and our allies where we can.
Can I just ask you about the politics with Number 10? I would have thought defence is a very popular subject for the public. I would think the public supports backing defence. So can you talk me why that dynamic might be tricky for a Defence Secretary?
I think public opinion has moved towards being more supportive of defence. I think the poisoning in Salisbury had a lot to do with that. People could see that this wasn't something just happening right over on the eastern side of NATO. It affected us over in the west, even though we're an island and a long way away from what was happening in the Ukraine. I think public opinion has moved. What the polls also show, though, is the public haven't yet come round to agreeing what they should give up if we are going to increase defence spending. And I don't see that they see the connection that really defence has to be the number one priority. And the example I give is climate change. I'm quite sure that Ukraine signed the climate change commitment originally. I'm sure they did. They would love to get to net zero. But you can't do that stuff if your country's being invaded. Defence has to come first and foremost, before you commit to anything else, dealing with poverty, dealing with climate change, helping overseas aid. You have to defend your own country first.
Michael Fallon, thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.